A senator just accused Donald Trump's Treasury Secretary nominee of reneging on responsibilities and called his behavior absolutely childish after he refused to answer basic questions about whether taxpayer-owned companies are breaking the law. And the nominee, Scott Bessent, just sat there while a senator explained that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are violating federal law and stock exchange rules, and Bessent's response was essentially, "Not my problem." Except it is his problem. Because as Treasury Secretary, he would oversee the department that bailed out Fannie and Freddie with $200 billion in taxpayer money. The Treasury Department owns preferred shares in these companies. Treasury staff manage the assets. The previous Treasury Secretary put them into conservatorship. And Scott Bessent is sitting in a confirmation hearing pretending he has no responsibility for ensuring these taxpayer-owned companies follow the law. So this week, Senator Jack Reed from Rhode Island spent 5 minutes absolutely eviscerating Scott Bessent for dodging responsibility while discussing serious violations of federal law. Take a look at this, and I'll give you my breakdown at the end.
Senator Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, the President announced on January 9th, in his words, quote, "Effective January 20th, 2026, I, as President of the United States, am calling for a one-year cap on credit card interest rates of 10%. In remarks at the World Economic Forum in Davos, the President further said, quote, "The profit margin for credit card companies now exceeds 50%. He also indicated that Americans are paying 28, 30% interest rates. You were one of his top economic advisors, Mr. Secretary. Do you support interest rate caps to improve affordability on credit?
I wholeheartedly support President Trump's policy, and I think that what you've just said would be in direct contrast to what Senator Warren said about this administration favoring the big banks. But those are facts.
Well, I don't think my statement indicates at all what Senator Warren said or meant. I wanted an answer. You gave me one. Yep. But let's look at the current situation. We already have legislation that protects service members by putting a 36% cap, not just on credit cards, but all credit relationships, and it protects them from being exploited. And as in my youth, I was a company commander and saw it firsthand. Would it make sense as a first step to provide a 36% interest rate for all Americans, not just service members?
36% doesn't seem like much protection to me, Senator.
Well, it's better than some of the things that are being presented to service members without the rates. These new plans to buy commodities, and sometimes the rates go to 500, and still today, you have entrepreneurs who are charging extraordinary rates, and particularly to vulnerable populations, which I know they don't congregate at Harvard Square, but they also don't hang out in New Haven either. So I think that would be a sound step, Mr. Secretary.
Senator, you haven't seen all of New Haven.
I haven't, but I've seen a lot of it, the parts that you might have missed. The situation at Fannie and Freddie is significant. We have significant federal interest financially in Fannie and Freddie. But under the director, Mr. Pulte, these taxpayer-owned assets are no longer in compliance with the law or with stock exchange listing standards. Pulte has appointed himself as director of both boards, even though the law says, quote, "The director may not hold any office, position, or employment in Fannie or Freddie." A majority of the Fannie board has not been determined to be independent. The audit committee is no longer comprised entirely of independent members. And the the governance has been sacked by political affiliates. These all are prohibited by law and regulation. So how will you bring them into compliance, Mr. Secretary?
That would be FHFA, not Treasury.
Excuse me. You are one of the largest, or the taxpayers are. You provided them, Treasury did, not you personally, a $200 million bailout in 2008, and you have no interest in Fannie or Freddie?
I'm very interested in Fannie and Freddie, and I'm interested in fulfilling the mission to the American people to keep mortgage rates low.
What about following the laws?
So again, the ask Director Pulte. I do not see I don't think this creates a
Well,
financial.
all right, you have nothing to do with Fannie and Freddie. Director Pulte has said that you and him are, quote, very aligned, and we meet regularly about the conservatorship. By the way, it's in conservatorship because of Secretary Paulson, your predecessor. According to Fannie and Freddie's annual reports, the companies, quote, continue to rely on financial support from Treasury pursuant to our senior preferred stock purchase agreement, under which taxpayers own 1 million preferred shares on a warrant to purchase up to 80% of their shares. Treasury staff manages those shares and warrants for the taxpayers. Your predecessor, Hank Paulson, placed these companies into conservatorship. So you have the premise or the power to place Fannie and Freddie into conservatorship. I would think that that gives you a little bit of leverage talking to Mr. Pulte about why he's not following the law. You're reneging on responsibilities, Mr. Secretary. And you're also, having been the senior person here, your behavior to some of my colleagues is absolutely childish. Thank you.
All right, let's talk about what you just watched, because this exchange perfectly captures everything wrong with how Donald Trump's nominees approach government service. Scott Bessent was asked direct questions about illegal activity at taxpayer-owned companies, and his response was to deflect and pretend he has no authority or responsibility to do anything about it. Let me break down what Senator Reid was asking about, because this is important. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are government-sponsored enterprises that were created to help Americans get mortgages. In 2008, during the financial crisis, these companies were on the verge of collapse. So Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson put them into conservatorship, and the federal government bailed them out with $200 billion in taxpayer money. Since then, taxpayers have owned preferred shares and warrants in these companies. Treasury staff manage those assets. The companies rely on financial support from Treasury, and legally, the Treasury Secretary has significant oversight authority because taxpayers own these companies. Now, under the current director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, a man named Billy Polt, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are violating federal law. Senator Reid laid out the violations very clearly. First, Polt appointed himself as director of both boards, even though federal law explicitly says the director may not hold any office, position, or employment in Fannie or Freddie. That's a direct violation of the statute. Second, a majority of the Fannie Mae board has not been determined to be independent. Stock exchange listing standards require independent boards. Fannie Mae is not in compliance. Third, the audit committee is no longer comprised entirely of independent members. Again, that violates stock exchange rules and federal regulations. Fourth, the governance structure has been packed with political affiliates. The companies are being run like partisan political operations instead of taxpayer-owned enterprises with legal obligations. All of this is prohibited by law and regulation. And Senator Reid asked Scott Bessent a very simple question: how will you bring them into compliance? And Bessent's response? That would be FHFA, not Treasury. Not my problem, not my responsibility. Talk to someone else. So Senator Reid pushes back. He says, you are one of the largest, or the taxpayers are. You provided them, Treasury did, not you personally, a $200 billion bailout in 2008. You have no interest in Fannie and Freddie? And Bessent says, I'm very interested in Fannie and Freddie, and I'm interested in it fulfilling its mission to the American people to keep mortgage rates low. Notice what he did there. Senator Reid asked about following the law, and Bessent answered with a talking point about keeping mortgage rates low. Those are not the same thing. You can care about mortgage rates and also care about whether taxpayer-owned companies are breaking federal law. In fact, you should care about both. But Bessent only wants to talk about one. So Senator Reid asks again, what about following the laws? And Bessent says, you should ask Director Polt. I don't think this creates a... And then he just trails off. He doesn't even finish the sentence because he has no answer. He has no defense. He's just hoping Senator Reid will move on. But Senator Reid doesn't move on. He points out that Director Polt has said publicly that he and Bessent are very aligned and we meet regularly about the conservatorship. So they're coordinating. They're working together. They're having regular meetings about how to manage these taxpayer-owned companies. But when asked about legal violations, Bessent suddenly has no involvement. And then Senator Reid drops the hammer. He says, according to Fannie and Freddie's annual reports, the companies continue to rely on financial support from Treasury pursuant to our senior preferred stock purchase agreement, under which taxpayers own 1 million preferred shares and a warrant to purchase up to 80% of their shares. Treasury staff manage those assets and warrants for the taxpayers. Your predecessor, Hank Paulson, placed these companies into conservatorship. So you have the power to place Fannie and Freddie into conservatorship. I would think that gives you a little bit of leverage talking to Mr. Pult about why he's not following the law. That's the point. Scott Bessent, as Treasury Secretary, would have enormous leverage over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Treasury owns the companies. Treasury bailed them out. Treasury can put them back into conservatorship if they're not following the law. And Bessent is sitting there pretending he has no authority and no responsibility to do anything about blatant legal violations. And then Senator Reid says something that I think captures the entire hearing. You're reneging on responsibilities, Mr. Secretary. And you're also, being the senior person here, your behavior to some of my colleagues is absolutely childish. Childish. That's the word Senator Reid used. And if you watch the context of this hearing, you understand why. When Senator Reid mentioned that vulnerable populations are being charged predatory interest rates, sometimes as high as 500%, Bessent made a sarcastic comment. Senator, you haven't seen all of New Haven. When confronted about legal violations at Fannie and Freddie, he deflected and said it's not his problem. This is a man who wants to be Treasury Secretary. This is a man who would oversee billions of dollars in taxpayer money, manage the federal government's finances, and have authority over taxpayer-owned companies. And he can't be bothered to answer direct questions about whether those companies are following the law. Let's also talk about the beginning of that exchange, because it's important context. Senator Reid asked Bessent if he supports President Trump's proposed 10% cap on credit card interest rates, and Bessent said, I wholeheartedly support President Trump's policy. Okay, fine. But then Senator Reid pointed out that we already have legislation protecting service members by capping their interest rates at 36%. And he asked, would it make sense to provide that same 36% cap for all Americans? And Bessent's response was dismissive. 36% doesn't seem like much protection to me, Senator. Think about that for a second. A 36% interest rate cap doesn't seem like much protection. But Trump's proposed 10% cap is something Bessent wholeheartedly supports. So which is it? Is 36% not enough protection? Or is 10% the right number? And if 36% isn't enough, why isn't Bessent fighting for something lower right now? The answer is simple. Bessent doesn't actually care about interest rate caps or consumer protection. He cares about saying whatever he thinks will get him confirmed. When Senator Reid asked about protecting all Americans the same way we protect service members, Bessent deflected. When Senator Reid pointed out that vulnerable populations are being exploited with 500% interest rates, Bessent made a sarcastic joke about New Haven. And that brings us back to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These are taxpayer-owned companies that exist to help Americans get affordable mortgages. And right now, they're being run in violation of federal law by a political appointee who's packing the boards with loyalists, ignoring independence requirements, and undermining the governance structure that's supposed to protect taxpayers. And when asked what he's going to do about it, Scott Bessent says, not my problem. Ask someone else. I'm very interested in keeping mortgage rates low, but don't ask me about following the law. That's unacceptable. If you're going to be Treasury Secretary, you don't get to pick and choose which responsibilities you'll take seriously. You don't get to say, I'm interested in the mission, but not the legal compliance. You don't get to meet regularly with the person violating the law and then pretend you have no leverage to stop it. Senator Reid is absolutely right to call this behavior childish, because that's exactly what it is. It's a grown man acting like he can talk his way out of accountability by deflecting and playing dumb. And this is who Donald Trump wants running the Treasury Department. A man who deflects questions about legal violations at taxpayer-owned companies. A man who treats consumer protection as a joke. A man who won't commit to using his authority to ensure federal laws are followed. The Senate is supposed to provide advice and consent on presidential nominees. That means actually scrutinizing whether these people are qualified, whether they're trustworthy, whether they'll uphold the law. And based on this hearing, Scott Bessent is showing us exactly who he is. He won't hold Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac accountable for breaking the law because he doesn't think it's his job. He won't fight for consumer protection because he doesn't think it matters. And he won't take responsibility because he's already learned that in Trump's administration, deflection and denial are more valuable than competence and integrity. Like, subscribe and share this everywhere, because every senator who votes to confirm Scott Bessent is telling the American people that dodging responsibility and ignoring the law are acceptable behaviors for Treasury Secretary, and we deserve better than that.